This driver, every time he sealed the truck, discreetly hid the seal in his sleeve. Mid-journey, he arbitrarily sold 2 beef hindquarters, and only then did he seal it back up. Upon arrival, he gave the porters some hush money and then bribed the warehouse manager. Once connections were smoothed over, he could enter the warehouse to rearrange the beef's placement. This way, no one would notice the missing 2 hindquarters. However, money that comes too easily makes people greedy. Until this delivery, the truck was completely empty. If this could still be swept under the rug, it would truly be absurd. But what was even more absurd was that when he was prosecuted, his lawyer helped him win the case. In fact, even he himself was astonished, not understanding why he was innocent, until the lawyer took him to a restaurant to meet a powerful figure in the underworld. It turned out that everything was manipulated by this person, and he was also the one who would lead Frank to a completely transformed life. An invisible assassin who once dominated the American underworld was about to be born. In the beginning, Frank was a working-class truck driver. All of his family's living expenses weighed heavily on his shoulders. His life was incredibly difficult and lacking, until one day, his truck broke down in the middle of the road. An old man at a gas station proactively came to help. The old man helped him fix his truck, creating an opportunity for the two to meet. Frank immediately felt that this old man had an extraordinary demeanor, but he didn't think much of it. With heavy life pressures, he wanted to earn extra income. Friends introduced him to a bar owner. This owner loved eating beef, and Frank happened to transport beef hindquarters. The owner asked him if he dared to supply the goods. In such a poor situation, there was nothing he wouldn't dare to do. So he took advantage of the owner's trust, discreetly faked the seal, and from that led to the previous stolen beef sales and his court appearance. To celebrate his victory in the lawsuit, he invited the lawyer to the bar, completely unaware that everything had been prearranged from the start. And this person was none other than Russell, also the one who had helped him fix his truck. Russell had recognized Frank as someone who could be put to good use from their very first meeting. Therefore, he created an opportunity for Frank to steal beef. When the lawyer tested Frank, he resolutely refused to reveal his accomplices. He had once killed 2 prisoners who dug their own graves in World War II, demonstrating his bravery, caution, and ruthlessness. This unquestioning obedience is exactly what Russell needed in a tool. Russell, in turn, was a godfather-level figure in the Mafia, respected by everyone in the underworld. Although Frank was Irish, he spoke Italian, which made Russell feel a connection. That night, they ate bread dipped in wine, chatting very happily. From then on, Frank's life as a laborer completely changed. He began working for Russell, beating people, collecting money, running errands. It seemed this was where he could truly utilize his abilities. Gradually, he became infected with the brutal aura of those in the underworld. One day, his daughter Peggy spilled something in a grocery store and was scolded by the owner. Frank immediately pulled his daughter and went to find the owner, dragged him outside, and resorted to his fists. The owner's finger was even stomped on and broken by him. He thought such strength could bring a sense of security to his daughter, but unexpectedly, in his daughter's eyes, there was more fear than anything else when she looked at him. From then on, a high wall was built between him and his daughter, something he was completely unaware of. When his third daughter was born, Russell personally attended the baptism. All the prominent figures in the underworld came, making Frank feel proud. To earn more money to support his wife and children, he secretly helped an owner named Whispers destroy a competitor's laundromat. Whispers paid him a bonus of $10,000. Frank carefully scouted the location and meticulously planned. Just as the explosives and gasoline were prepared, Russell suddenly sent someone to stop him, because the laundromat owner he intended to blow up was none other than the Philadelphia crime boss named Angelo. If Russell hadn't intervened in time, he might have been added to the gang's hit list. To repay his boss's generosity, Frank proactively killed Whispers as arranged by Russell. He threw the used gun into the Schuylkill River. The bottom of the river was piled high with guns, and each gun represented a gang rivalry and a life. The next day, the case was reported in the newspaper. From then on, everything changed. Russell assigned him more and more assassination missions. He always completed his assignments on time and lived up to the trust. Russell introduced him to other bosses and also introduced him to a waitress with an outstanding demeanor. Thus, Frank's marriage had a crisis. He left his first wife and married the restaurant waitress. Russell had almost given him everything he desired. To show his respect for Russell, he worked even harder. The relationship between the two families also grew closer. The only thing was that Frank's daughter, Peggy, didn't seem to like Russell much, perhaps because of Russell's difficult-to-hide underworld aura. Before long, under Russell's guidance, Frank met the second person who would change his life, Jimmy Hoffa, and from that, a classic dialogue went down in cinematic history. Jimmy was the national president of the Truckers Union and one of the most influential figures in America at the time. It was said that the level of adoration Americans had for him was no less than for Elvis Presley and JFK. Behind his glamorous image, Jimmy was also involved in illegal activities. The $8 billion in truckers' pension funds he held in his hands was a lucrative target in the eyes of many. Projects that couldn't get legal bank loans often turned to Jimmy's union. Among them, the casinos opened by the underworld were the most dependent on the union's loans. Know that the gambling city of Las Vegas achieved its current splendor thanks to the continuous infusion of funds from the union. Jimmy was responsible for lending money to the gangs, and the gangs also helped Jimmy consolidate his position in the union. Russell was Jimmy's staunch supporter. Now, Russell arranged Frank to be by Jimmy's side precisely to gain deeper control over the union. Frank did not disappoint. The first thing he did upon arriving in Chicago was to destroy Jimmy's rival taxi fleet. Frank's courage and decisiveness were greatly admired by Jimmy. From then on, Jimmy considered Frank his most trusted confidant. He always took Frank along on business trips, even habitually leaving a door open for him at night while sleeping. Of course, Frank was also absolutely loyal to him, resolving many problems. Naturally, the relationship between the two families also grew closer. But unlike Russell, Jimmy's upright image was greatly admired by Frank's youngest daughter, Peggy. Peggy often wore Jimmy's badge on her chest, even advocating at school about Jimmy's contributions to millions of truck drivers. By 1960, Kennedy had been elected president, and the whole country rejoiced. Frank's new wife also gave birth to their fourth daughter. His life and career could be said to be flourishing. At this time, Russell assigned Frank a secret mission. He drove a truck to Florida, where someone was already waiting. But these people looked very strange. It turned out they were all Cuban exiles. Only then did Frank realize he was transporting a batch of weapons, and these very weapons formed the famous Bay of Pigs invasion. It turned out that Kennedy had been elected president with the support of the gangs, represented by Russell. After taking office, Kennedy immediately ordered an attack on Fidel Castro's revolutionary government in Cuba to help the gangs re-establish casinos in Cuba. Frank inadvertently became an accomplice in this invasion. Unfortunately, the operation was unsuccessful. Russell looked visibly troubled. On the other hand, Jimmy was in a precarious situation because, in the presidential election, he had supported Nixon, even donating $500,000 to the campaign team. When Kennedy took power, his brother became the Attorney General. The first thing he did was launch a comprehensive investigation into Jimmy's Truckers Union. They wiretapped Jimmy's phone and even formed a specialized task force for his arrest with the sole purpose of putting Jimmy in jail. Russell supported the Kennedy administration, while the Kennedy administration wanted to take down Jimmy. This foreshadowed a conflict of interest between Jimmy and Russell. However, Frank still managed to maneuver between the two, serving both in turn. The union fund managed by Jimmy was basically lent to gangs, and naturally, it could not withstand scrutiny. He was helpless, not knowing what to do, only able to vent his anger on subordinates. But Frank, being in a corner not directly affiliated with the union, was caught in the crossfire and angrily wanted to quit. Jimmy hastily chased after him to apologize. A usually arrogant Jimmy bowing down to Frank showed that Frank had long become a close family member in his heart. To garner support and win hearts, Jimmy decided to organize a national union rally. That night, Frank prepared a gun to accompany him. This scene happened to be seen by his daughter when she woke up. Perhaps in the child's mind, her father had become a dangerous person. Jimmy spoke passionately. Below the stage, tens of thousands of people supported him, especially when he introduced Vice President Fitz, hoping he could protect him. But unexpectedly, this person later became his rival. Jimmy thought he had everything under control. He aggressively bribed the jury and officials to be acquitted. Thus, his position at the hearing quickly became favorable. But a new opponent appeared before him. Tony, president of Local 560. This person also had another identity, the New Jersey crime boss. Tony's power grew stronger and stronger, directly threatening Jimmy. So, Jimmy decided to promote Frank to president of Local 326 to counter Tony of Local 560. And so, Frank transformed from an ordinary truck driver into an underworld assassin, and then from an underworld assassin, he transformed himself into a glamorous union president. All of this was brought about by Jimmy. Therefore, to express his respect for Jimmy, he wholeheartedly worked for the union's interests, resolutely not taking a single cent from the union fund for himself. As a result, just a few days after he left Jimmy was assassinated at the hearing. Fortunately, the assailant used a toy gun, which frightened Jimmy, making him hastily call Frank back. Only with Frank by his side could he feel at ease. In 1963, a shocking event occurred nationwide. Kennedy was assassinated. His brother also resigned accordingly. This meant that all charges against Jimmy were dropped. To express his displeasure with Kennedy, Jimmy forced his staff to raise the national flag that had been lowered to half-mast back up. But his good days didn't last too long. His bribery of the jury was exposed, and in 1967, Jimmy was arrested and imprisoned for obstructing justice. In prison, he still remotely controlled Vice President Fitz through his lawyer and the financial department, indirectly controlling the union's lending activities. He often deliberately delayed loans that the vice president had approved, which greatly annoyed the gangs. So, Russell arranged for Frank to deliver a stern warning to the union's financial department. Although Frank was already a local union president, he was still Russell's assassin, callable at any time. From then on, no matter who wanted to profit from the union fund, Vice President Fitz would readily disperse funds. In other words, the union had escaped Jimmy's control, but Jimmy, still in prison, was completely unaware. At the same time, Tony, president of Local 560, was arrested for extortion. He was Jimmy's sworn enemy, and ironically, both were imprisoned together. One time, they coincidentally met during a meal. Jimmy, with his arrogant nature, spoke contemptuous words, especially the phrase, "people like you," which completely infuriated his opponent. Although Tony was small in stature, when angered, he became as aggressive as a rabid dog. In another development, Frank received a new assassination mission. The victim was also a local gang leader who had sent someone to assassinate the leader of the Italian Human Rights League, angering Russell. Furthermore, this person had spoken disrespectfully to Russell at a party. Frank outwardly politely advised the opponent, but in reality, without Russell even needing to speak, he knew what he had to do. So he meticulously chose 2 small pistols, scouted the opponent's restaurant beforehand, and precisely calculated the assassination location. The next day, he calmly walked into the restaurant, frantically opening fire right in front of the opponent's family. There was no glamorous prelude. The entire process was clean, decisive. After the job was done, he, as usual, went to the riverbank to dispose of the evidence. The TV broadcast news of the restaurant murder. He was all too familiar with it, but his daughter Peggy's eyes were heavy. Just like when she was little, she knew it was very likely her father who had caused it. A few years later, Jimmy bribed Nixon to receive a presidential pardon. He publicly announced to all reporters that he would reclaim the Union presidency. But he didn't know that times had changed. The gangs had deeply infiltrated the Union, and even his former Vice President Fitz had colluded with his sworn enemy, Tony. Tony had controlled the votes in the Northeast, and Vice President Fitz was very likely to be elected president. The only way for him to reclaim his position now was to swallow his pride and beg Tony for support. Frank had a very hard time convincing Jimmy. But because the two had fought in prison, Tony deliberately wore shorts to the meeting and was 15 minutes late, while Jimmy had never waited for anyone for more than 10 minutes. Although Frank tried his best to mediate, neither could suppress the tension-filled words. Furthermore, Tony had always nursed a grudge over Jimmy's past remark, "people like you." The negotiation quickly turned into a fight. In a fit of rage, Jimmy wanted Frank to help him take down Tony. But Frank knew well that the gangster syndicate behind Russell could not agree. Jimmy sought help from the gangs without success. He then turned to publicly attacking Vice President Fitz. But the vice president now had the gangs backing him, no longer the weakling he once was. He first blew up Jimmy's confidentiat, then fired Jimmy's wife from her union position. At this point, Jimmy completely lost his temper, even speaking rudely, forgetting the unspoken rules of the underworld. These words completely infuriated the gangs. But because of the friendship between Frank and Jimmy, Russell decided to have Frank inform Jimmy that the organization wanted him to retire. However, Jimmy was not someone who easily gave in. Frank went back and forth, conveying peace talks between the two sides, but to no avail. Even when Russell personally intervened to persuade him, Jimmy still could not recognize reality. On the other hand, the union was about to host a tribute dinner for Frank. The guests were prominent figures from all walks of life: gangs, capitalists, and local officials. They had one thing in common: they all disliked Jimmy. But this did not affect Jimmy's presence, because this was the most important moment in his dear friend Frank's life. Jimmy gave Frank a watch as a souvenir. This was proof of their friendship. But Frank knew that this was also their last beautiful memory, because the gangs had learned that Jimmy had once said that if he regained the Union, he would recall the dispersed loans. This directly affected the gang's slice of the pie. Russell and several other gang leaders seemed to be plotting something. Frank understood that they were very likely to act against Jimmy. Seeing Jimmy and his daughter Peggy still dancing leisurely, Frank looked visibly burdened and anxious. There was nothing he could do. After the party, Russell gave Frank a gold ring. There were only 3 such rings in the world. The other 2 belonged to Russell and another gang leader. Frank was the only Irishman to own one. Russell's purpose in doing this was not only for Frank to work wholeheartedly for him, but also to protect Frank. Russell asked Frank and 2 family members to accompany him to Detroit to attend a wedding. It was called attending a wedding, but in reality, it was to execute a secret plan. Along the way, Frank repeatedly called Jimmy, urging him to sit down and reconcile, but Jimmy refused every time. When they were a few hours away from Detroit, Russell made a phone call. This very phone call made everything definitive. Frank called Jimmy. Surprisingly, Jimmy changed his previous attitude and decided to reconcile. He would meet his sworn enemy Tony tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. During dinner, Russell told Frank that the plan had changed. Frank seemed to understand everything. That night, he lay awake, tossing and turning, repeatedly looking at the phone on his bedside table. But the stance had been set, so he couldn't call Jimmy. What pained him even more was that Russell had chosen him to kill Jimmy. On one hand, because Frank was very close to Jimmy, only by having Frank be the assassin could he prove his loyalty to the gangster organization, preventing him from being implicated. On the other hand, Russell wanted to exploit Jimmy's absolute trust in Frank. At this moment, Frank's eyes welled up with tears. Russell asked him to fly to Detroit first. Before leaving, he deliberately left his sunglasses behind, implying, "Don't forget your family is still here." Frank suppressed his emotions and went to Detroit alone. Upon landing, he got into the car prepared by the gang. In the car, there was a map and a pistol. As he passed the agreed-upon meeting spot for him and Jimmy, he saw Jimmy waiting for him in the car. He could have greeted Jimmy like an old friend, but at that moment, he was a cold-blooded assassin. He arrived at the so-called negotiation point. The people inside were laying new carpet, a preparation for Jimmy's murder. The gang members then took him to pick up Jimmy. Jimmy was initially a bit suspicious, but when he saw Frank in the back seat, he completely dropped his guard, got into the car, and warmly embraced Frank. It should be known that he usually disliked waiting, yet he had waited for Frank for 40 minutes there. Upon arrival, Jimmy deliberately asked Frank if he had brought anything. Jimmy had no idea that the gun was meant for him. The 2 entered the house. Frank drew his gun. Jimmy saw the room's layout and realized it was a trap, hastily telling Frank to leave. Frank didn't hesitate, cruelly shooting his friend in the head. Returning by plane, Russell handed him back his sunglasses. He didn't say a word. The 2 then drove to Detroit to attend that unimportant wedding. That night, Jimmy's body, along with the carpet, was pushed into the crematorium by the gang members. From then on, former Union President Jimmy completely vanished from the world. The whole family was watching the news about Jimmy's disappearance. His daughter Peggy sensed something from Frank's panicked expression. From then on, Peggy never spoke another word to him. The false comfort call to Jimmy's wife caused Frank to bear guilt for the rest of his life. Afterwards, in all investigations, everyone remained tight-lipped. Coupled with some related individuals being killed, the police still could not find any clues about Jimmy. This leaves Jimmy's disappearance an unsolved case to this day. However, the gangs did not continue to rule the world by eliminating every opposing force. In the 1980s, the U.S. government ordered a crackdown on gangs. Some were assassinated, some were arrested. Even big figures like Russell were betrayed by their subordinates and went to prison. Frank was also sentenced to 18 years in prison for blowing up a crane. The once powerful dark forces would eventually gradually disappear in the currents of history. Who would have thought that Russell, who once dominated the underworld, wielding immense power, would eventually become an old man in a wheelchair after a stroke? Other gang leaders suffered from urinary incontinence or limb diseases. The rest of their lives would also be spent in prison. Frank and Russell, in prison, once again ate bread dipped in grape juice. But Russell had lost all his teeth. Time had stolen everything from him, and also brought him clarity. After decades, he finally brought up Jimmy again. Jimmy was a good man. I never wanted things to go that far. In the end, Russell and the other old men all died in prison. Only Frank survived until he was released. His wife also passed away from lung cancer. His daughter Peggy attended the funeral but still refused to look at him. Even when he waited in line for a long time at the bank where Peggy worked, Peggy still avoided him. So he could only live alone, facing countless pills by himself. Finally, due to severe arthritis, he could no longer stand up. So he entered a nursing home. Every day he confessed to the priest, trying to find peace of mind. The police came to him, wanting him to reveal the truth about the old case, but he still lived in the world of the underworld, still keeping secrets as he always had, refusing to answer. He also demanded to see his lawyer. When the police said his lawyer had died of old age, he couldn't imagine that young people nowadays didn't even know Jimmy Hoffa. Their era was completely over. Frank chose a green coffin for himself. It used to be his family's favorite color and also the color of the Irish flag. He didn't know when, but he also developed the habit of leaving the door slightly ajar. Perhaps he was begging for Jimmy's forgiveness. Perhaps he was waiting for his daughter to visit him one day. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching the movie. What do you think of this film? Please comment below.